and welcome back to Un Poquito podcast. Before we get into the episode, I'd like to take a second and thank a few of our patrons who helped make the show happen. Thank you, Zaltino, Your Boy Harold, Vanessa Peralta, Tracy Salo, Susana Guzman, Stephanie, Tiana Quijano, Serria Sora Gil, SD, Sandra Guerrero, Safe Word, Ron McGowan, Riley Timberman, Rafael Flores, Priscilla Gonzalez, Poisonous Flower, Osandia, Nicholas Moreno, Nicholas Romo, Natasha Garcia, Natalie G, Mithril Maverick, Ichula Bonita, Maya Rooney, Mary Rios, Marcus Perez, Lucy, Luis Delgado, Kathy Saldana, Kate La Santa, Casey Hendricks, Judith Baltazar, Jose Reyes, Jose Martinez, Javier Arinaga, Izzy Sandoval, Imperium Sloth, Horror Lass, Freddie, Fernando Arinaga, Daisy Flores, Craftiest Chavez, Chris, Capital Chris, Cheyenne Owings, Celine, Rianne Ayuga, Beatrice Gihanna, Antonio Hernandez, Angel Reyes, Amanda Pinedo, and at Flores. Thank you so much for your help. We could not do this show without you. If you're interested in joining our Patreon, you can follow the links in the description below.
I think we should take a moment to shout out our sponsor.
Our sponsor? Who's that?
LegacyTeasandSpices.com.
What?
Bow, 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 bow.
Legacy Teas and Spices is our mom's company, and she sells teas and spices blended by hand. Ryan works for the company.
What? I do. I pack all the orders.
What do you got for us today, Ryan?
Today we have vanilla lemongrass, which is like one of the most popular flavors. It's great. It's herbal, non-caffeinated, and it tastes delicious.
You can also try my signature blend, Domsy the Bombsy, which is a black tea mate base made with cacao nibs and coconut. Tastes
Coconut? Is that because you're a coconut?
Fuck! Go to LegacyTeasandSpices.com and use code UP20 for 20% off your order. Hi, Mom.
Hi, Mom.
We also have some upcoming stand-up shows. You can catch me at the Elysian Theater on September 8th in Frogtown.
I actually have a few shows coming up. The first one is September 4th. I'm going to be at our favorite, Chatterbox in Covina. Ba, 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 ba.
I'll be there hanging out. You can just hang out with me.
And then the last show is in Redlands at Laugh Local on September 8th as well.
And you can find all of the ticketing information in the links below. Thank you so much. Enjoy the show.
Ba, 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 ba.
We're not going to keep doing that.
Hello, I'm Ryan Reyes.
And I'm Dominic Angel.
And together we're Un Poquito.
Podcast.
It feels like you're trying so hard not to go. Bah, 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 bah. We've done it like 12 times today.
I don't want to do it anymore, but it's really fun to do.
It is.
Thank you for joining us. Go ahead, if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment. Comments are sexy, you know what I'm saying? Check us out on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, leave us a rating and a review, and also follow us on all platforms, including Instagram and TikTok at Un Poquito Pod. And
you can leave us an email at unpoquitopod@gmail.com.
Thank you for reminding me. Send us an email. Ryan reads all of them.
I do.
But yeah.
So today we're actually doing a book review, and it's a book that Dominic found actually. What's it called again?
It's called You Sound Like a White Girl by Julissa Arce.
And can I ask, what brought this book to your attention? Like, how'd you find this book?
Well, we knew that we wanted to do a book, and it's been a while. I don't read all that that often, but anymore. But I wanted to find something that was more modern, even though there's a lot of like really great classics, you know. It would have been great to read, Reign of Gold or something, but that book is like thicker than the Bible. So it's like, I wanted to give us something that was modern, but also that was like digestible, right. That we can really take our time to process like how it made us feel. And so I was looking up on like different lists, doing some research on like there was a lot of great like books. I actually wanted to do something that was fiction.
Right.
This is nonfiction, but the reason why I wanted to do this book is because, we did our Latin identity episode, and when we were doing Isimo, like that is the point of our show, is to kind of like figure out our identities as Latinos, and this book really stood out to me for that reason. The kind of synopsis of the book is that Julissa Arce is somebody that came to the country undocumented, ran out their visa when they, came as a kid, ran out their visa, and worked really hard to become a successful person, and like always felt the pressure to assimilate. And she ended up reaching like she ended up like becoming very successful, quote unquote, in her life. She worked for Goldman Sachs. She dealt with billionaires. She reached a certain level of what some would argue would be the American dream. And she kind of found that it wasn't enough for her to like the promise that she thought was offered to her of like being able to assimilate and working hard was still not enough for her to be accepted by what she thought she wanted.
Yeah, I definitely felt a lot of that in the very opening. She opens with a analogy. Essentially, it's someone shows up to a race that they believe they've prepped for, they believe that they're ready for, they know what they're supposed to do in this race. And when they arrive at the start of the race, they tell you, oh yeah, also this is going to be a hurdle race. So you're going to have obstacles in front of you. And for some reason, no matter how many obstacles this person clears, no matter how much of the race they complete, every time they make a lap, there's just more and more hurdles. They won't let them finish the race. They won't let them join the others on the pedestals that are accepting the rewards. They just keep on going and on going, no matter how hard they try.
Yeah.
I think that was a great analogy for what she's talking about in the book.
Yeah, for sure. And it really, it kind of jumped out to me. One of the big things that I honestly recommend anybody read this book, especially if you're somebody that struggles with identity. It's kind of like that cliche of like when somebody like money doesn't buy you happiness. Like, oh, you see all these people that are like super wealthy and even they're not satisfied and they're not happy. Like it doesn't fill that void. Like if you're somebody that is a pocho or no sabo and like you kind of felt not Mexican enough and like even we don't even feel American enough, even though we're born here, we are American. It's not that I'm happy or relieved, but it really is just like, damn, like we're all fucking in this shit. Like knowing from Julissa's perspective of like being somebody from Mexico and being Mexican, even she who was born in Mexico and had to learn English and learn how to speak it with perfection, even she gets called not Mexican enough.
Yeah, like going into the book, even just the title I think is a great representation of what the book is about. Mm-hmm. It's a great representation of that idea because you read that phrase and as a Latino, as a person of color in general, but in this context as a Latino, you immediately know and resonate with that phrasing. Even if that specific phrase, you sound like a white girl, has never been said to you, a version of that has been said to you. Like you even have that joke about K-Earth, right?
Yeah, just like, I'm not going to do the bit, but like, growing up in American culture, like the joke is based in reality. Is that I was talking to a friend at work and we're just talking about bullshit. Like, and I said like, this was actually from two different interactions from like two kind of older white guys. Was that one guy I actually did bring up how I liked K-Earth 101 because I used to listen to it on my way to work.
Right.
And he was like, "What? You listen to K-Earth?" And I was like, "Yeah, we're like, obviously, like I'm from here, you know what I mean?"
Yeah.
And then another time, like that guy actually said his name is Dalton. Dalton. I was talking to him. We were talking about Arrested Development because season 4 had just come out, and so there was like this big premiere where like you could go like watch the first 2 episodes, and so he was there. And we were just like talking about it. And he goes like, in the middle of our conversation, out of nowhere, he just like takes it upon himself to be like, wow, you're really well assimilated.
Yeah. And I feel like there's two parts to that. One of them is like, no shit, I was born here. But two is also, we kind of did face a form of assimilation. The only difference I feel like between us being born here and someone who came here from somewhere else is that we just didn't know we were being assimilated. We weren't intentionally trying to assimilate. It's just the environment we grew up in.
Yeah, that was interesting to think about that, like Julissa talks about in the book, is that like all of this is through survival. Like how like every life that like Latinos have led up until this point has all been based on survival. So some of them, you know, a lot of people have chosen to not teach their kids Spanish or to discourage them from like speaking Spanish and encourage them to learn English because they don't want them to like have any obstacles in their way, or they don't want them to be discriminated against.
Yeah, it was like there was a purpose to it.
Yeah, there was a purpose to it. But that's interesting is because it's like even us like understanding that we are still part of that element. We are still part of that assimilation process. We're like actually kind of like post assimilation in a way. You know what I mean?
Yeah, we're kind of like Christopher Nolan's Bane. You know, we were born in it, molded by it.
No hablo español. But yeah, it's so stupid. No, so it's what I really like about this book is that it's very concise, but there's so much information in it.
Yeah.
Because she draws a lot from her own personal stories. She talks a lot about her parents, particularly her mother. And that story is kind of just like really sad. Like I was like actually getting emotional, like hearing about it when her mom talks about how she's depressed essentially because she feels that she has nothing to show for giving everything up to come to the United States.
Yeah.
And then she ends up going back to Mexico with nothing. And like doesn't have the life that she envisioned for herself when she came to the United States. That's something that's very interesting to me of like, I don't know. It's all these things that you understand, like in theory, it's like part of you is like, you have like a passing understanding of it and acknowledgement of it, but you don't really soak it in of just like when she said, like Julissa says that her parents coming to the United States, their life was a debt to be paid back for leaving Mexico. Right. And that is something that to me, like, just kind of like clicked with me that I didn't understand that of just like the pressures that immigrants face, you know, when they come here.
Yeah.
Of like having to pay that back, having it necessary to be worth it for them. Because even though they might be facing struggles in their homeland, you know, they came to the United States to better that. So it's like they have to better that. And sorry, I'm talking a lot. Let me let you go, and then I'll talk.
Well, I was gonna say like it brings me back to the metaphor she used and why it's like so apt. It's like in her mother's instance, and in a lot of people's situations that are similar, it's like they got tired of running. They got tired of leaping hurdles. So they stopped racing, but then it's like, well, then they just walked away without ever getting a medal, even though they deserved one.
Yeah. And well, because what she talks about, so again, like she touches on so much in this book, and honestly, like you could probably knock it out in a week, like less than that.
Yeah, I would say I definitely appreciate that we listened to it in audiobook. As someone with ADHD, it was so much easier.
Yeah, we did do the audiobook version. I didn't want to let that secret out, but you know, Ryan's a snitch.
It's reading. Stop it.
I mean, honestly, it is fun, especially like we both have vision problems. We both have attention problems. Like, it is easier for me to like listen to things as a drive. I digress. But it's very digestible, and there's a lot of information in it. What did you just say? Because there was something that I wanted to talk about with that.
I referenced the analogy.
The analogy.
That.
Oh, sorry. I remember now. It's because, so the three things she kind of draws on this is like her experience, her own life experience, plus historical events. There's a lot of like historical dates of things that happened to Mexicans throughout American history. A lot of stuff that we don't know, that we're not taught, and like unless you go to college to actually like study these things or like research it, it's like very hard to come by. But the other thing, you know, she talks about is like her vision, or what she thinks is like a lot of her ideas of like what's happening and what needs to happen for these things to be resolved. And you're talking about people are leaving, and so she talks a lot about how today, currently, because this book was published in this year, so it's very recent. She references a lot of recent current events. Excuse me. But she talks about how Latinos are now redefining their own success, and because for so long it's been sought after in the confines of white supremacy, of white American definitions. So now it's like we're understanding like, oh, we can break out of that.
It kind of reminds me of, not to like be super pop culture-y, but have you heard of quiet quitting?
Oh, just like leaving?
No. So, but like, have you heard this term?
No.
So there's a concept that's been growing on the internet called quiet quitting. And the huge misconception about it, well, there's a couple. I even made a TikTok about it today. The biggest misconception is that it's this mentality that younger generations have, like Gen Z, like the youngest adults of today entering the workforce and just having a lazy mentality and not wanting to do hard work. Mm-hmm. And that's a huge misunderstanding. The biggest thing was, first of all, a lot of the people promoting this idea are people our age, people older than us, like older millennials, and even like a portion of Gen X is pushing this idea. And what it is if you're giving your all, you're giving 150%, you're giving 200%, and there is no visible path to reciprocation or advancement, if there's no acknowledgement of your hard work, then you just decide to only put what's necessary, only put what you need to get your stuff done. And where it breaks a little bit from the analogy is specifically in the context of work. It's like they're not doing less work. They're not stopping work. They're not quitting their job. They're only doing 100%. They're never exceeding 100%. They're doing the maximum required for their position, for what other people are willing to give them for it. And I feel like this is kind of like it's not exactly the same thing, but it's the same mentality of essentially knowing your worth and knowing when it's enough.
Well, it is relatable because, you know, when we had our city on Isimo, you know, they talked about how immigrants are often viewed under the lens of their productivity and their value to the economy.
Right.
And, you know, Julissa talks about it too in her book of how a lot of activists, because anti-immigrant, you know, racist people often use how immigrants and undocumented people, illegals, are a drain on the American economy, how they're a drain on our resources, how all they do is take and they don't give anything back. So a lot of activists will point out that actually that's not true. Actually, there's a benefit, and actually it would benefit us more to like give these people citizenship, or allow them faster, easier ways to citizenship. And so a lot of that comes from like the having to play defense all the time. But she wanted to make it very clear, much like Atsiri, it was like, no, we're here to exist. Like, we're people. Like, we're here to live a life, and we have that right. Like, we deserve to live in respect.
Yeah, and also in response to that, she says two things that I think were like refreshing to hear out loud finally. Because one of them is a thing that I also say, which is like it's frustrating that the more conservative side of America is often using immigration as a scapegoat for like lack of work. You know, they're stealing our jobs. They're stealing our livelihoods. And it's like, but you're only looking at the people that are receiving the work, that need the work just as much as you do. Sometimes more. They're trying to, help their families that are in a worse situation, instead of looking at the person who's giving your job away, at the person who's profiting off of the labor of people who are willing to work for less, who are cheating you out of a job. Nobody's looking at them. Nobody's criticizing them. You're instead allowing yourselves to be pitted against each other, down on the lower levels of the economic ladder.
Right. And that was something that towards the end that Julissa points out too, where the United States has this idea of America first. America first. We have to take care of our own before we let in immigrants, before we give money to starving countries, before we give food, give aid to any other countries. We got to take care of America first, take care of our veterans, take care of our homeless, blah, 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 whatever. But it's also like, Julissa says like, no, America owes all of their success to every poor country on the planet, essentially. Like, yeah,
it's like literally on the backs of other people suffering. And not only that, but there was an important statistic that she pointed out that 65% of Latinos living in America are legal and born here.
Yeah.
And we're seen as a monolith. It's not just the quote unquote bad ones. It's not just the ones coming in quote unquote the wrong way. They see all of us that way, regardless. They immediately, like, if someone racist met me, that's where their brain would go to immediately, regardless of understand. I'm from Texas. I was born in Texas. That doesn't matter to them.
Everything's bigger in Texas, huh?
Oh. That was the first time it actually was a fat joke. God damn it.
A good one,
I waddled into that one. Bum, bum, bum.
Moving on. Yeah, that was crazy. I remember, have you ever had an experience of like weird racism?
Yes, I think I shared it in a previous episode.
We talked a little bit about Patreon.
Yeah, so there was a couple instances. The one that I would say is weird because it was assumed and it was like just a random interruption of my day was the trash can thing, which was we used to work together in this communal building. It had multiple businesses on every floor. We worked for a vape company. It was like a small warehouse on like one of the top floors. And one day I'm taking out the trash for our business and I'm wheeling it. It's a giant wheelbarrow full of trash. So I'm wheeling it back to the elevator and some white, like 80s cliche, like someone out of Saved by the Bell, but one of the bullies comes walking up in his flip-flops and his like bright pink polo with his collar up and sunglasses on inside. And he goes, "Hey, when you're done, can you go up to the third floor?" I don't know why he's Southern. He wasn't Southern. "Can you go up to the third floor and catch our trash as well? Nobody's shown up in weeks and we're just wondering what the fuck is up with that." And I was like, "Oh, I don't work for the building. This is the trash from my business or the business I work for. Everyone takes out their own trash." And he was, "We have to take out our own trash?" It's like, and I was like, "Yes." And then I just closed the door on him.
That shit's so crazy. Like, I mean, that's kind of outside of what we're talking about. Like,
Right.
but it's not. It is, but it isn't. It's just like
Yeah.
this weird entitlement of just like, there's a certain type of white American that just has this strange view of how things run, like how things are supposed to be, and connecting it to the book. She talks a lot about how Julissa ended up becoming, working for Goldman Sachs and being told things like, "Oh, you speak so well," or "Did you take the bar?" She was a lawyer,
Right.
and so, "Did you take the bar in Spanish?" Like all of these like little tiny comments that weren't necessarily rude, but that were steeped in like, "Oh, people like you aren't supposed to be here.
Right.
You're different. You're not supposed to be part of all of this. We're supposed to be able we talked about on the Patreon how like white people don't acknowledge like people of color while they're walking. They just like kind of walk through them. They just assume subconsciously without even processing it that they're going to move out of the way.
Yeah, like even though the biggest upset to that guy was he had to take out his own trash, the passive thought that he had was it was supposed to be my job. Because
not only, there's so much to that, was that he just looked at you and like was like, "Oh, Mexican guy with the wheelbarrow."
Yeah, because here's the thing is like it was a very like busy building. I am confident that he would have run into another person who was not brown, who was taking out some kind of trash and did not expect the same thing.
Yeah, it was like one of those creative places where there's a lot of different types of businesses, and there's a lot of different types of like artists going on. There's a lot of fabrics.
There's a lot of trash.
A lot of trash. but no, 100% was just like, oh, he saw a big Mexican dude with a cart and was like, "Oh, that guy takes out the trash." Like,
yeah.
And just assume that based on how you looked, on top of him not even considering, "Hey, we have to take out the even if you thought that somebody else was supposed to take out the trash, you just assumed that the problem was going to resolve itself.
Yeah, like 2 weeks in, ask somebody. Yeah, but it was also like, I mean, there was the other instance, which I feel like maybe references more to this idea that we are faceless to them, that we are a monolith. Mm-hmm. And I won't tell the whole story because it's on the Patreon. Check it out. But essentially, I went to a store, and that day it was raining. I was doing it for a different job I had. When I got in line, I was being followed by a white woman who worked there. She was being calm about it. She never confronted me aggressively or up front, but she followed me throughout the store. I was only there maybe 5 minutes. And at one point, a Latina cashier sees her doing this. And so she's like, "Hey, I don't know, her name was like Rosalie. You need to take your break, Rose." And this woman was like, "No, I'm fine. I don't need a break today." And she's like, "No, the manager's been telling you to take your breaks. You have to take your break." And looking back, I realized she was helping me out. But the most frustrating thing was I came back the very next day. It was not raining. So I was in my apron. I was clean cut. I was wearing my work clothes. And I walk into the door, and she's the greeter that day. And she just goes, "Hello, welcome to the Container Store." And it's like, the fuck? How do you not remember me from yesterday?
I like how you said, "I'm not going to tell the whole story," and then proceeded to tell the whole story.
Yeah. Still check out the Patreon. But yeah, and it's like this thing of like, it makes me think of the things that she mentions a lot of dates, but one particular date she mentions frequently, especially in the second half, which was August 3rd. I think it was
2019.
Was it 2019?
I believe so.
Yeah, it was the day that a white man in Texas, in El Paso specifically, decided to grab a gun that he had been saving and go to a
mass shooting.
You go to a Walmart, and this is a quote by him: "Kill as many Mexicans as possible." And one thing she pointed out was it was something like 23, not even like 50 people died. No.
Well, my understanding was that the guy was anti-immigrant. He's like he was anti-immigration.
Yes.
And so his thing was that he was going to go kill as many Mexicans as he could. So he went and carried out this slaughter, and not that they deserved it less or more or anything. You know, nobody deserves it.
But this is a point to like it's not really about that. It doesn't matter to them.
Yeah, that like the majority of them were born in the United States. They were actual like citizens.
Yeah, and honestly, like looking back when I found out about that, that was something daunting to me because as I said earlier, I was born in El Paso. Like we have family in El Paso.
Yeah.
And they live on a different side of El Paso than where it happened. So, you know, luckily they were never in harm's way, but they very much could have been. I very much could have been. And it wouldn't have mattered that I was born here.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing is like, that's how people view Mexicans or view Latinos as being these forever immigrants. Like, it's like we're not allowed to achieve American identity no matter what.
They don't mind us running the race. They just won't let us on the podium.
Yeah. I mean, the metaphor.
Honestly, it's such a good metaphor.
Well, the thing like Julissa talks about in the book of the census, you know,
yes.
and how there's all these categories for all these different races. You know, back, 100 years ago on the census, there was 60 different categories that you could fill in for race.
Yeah, it sounded like 64.
Yeah, and over time it got smaller and smaller, and so now they group together large swaths of people, and they specifically exclude, Hispanic and Latinos from that.
Yeah,
and there's a lot of stuff that goes into that. Because I remember I used to work for the census. Like in 2010, I was going door to door to people. And during training, they specifically told us when we go to Latinos' houses, when we go to Mexican, have them check. There's two separate questions. There's your ethnicity question and there's your race question. But it's like we're singled out of being like, are you Hispanic, Latino? And you check that. And then they were like, well, what do they check for race? And they were like, it was in our training to tell people to check white.
Yeah, I remember it wasn't a census because I think you have to be 18 and over to do the census, right?
No, census counts for everybody.
Well, I mean, there was a similar thing that we had to fill out for school when I was like 16, and I was taking a computer mapping class. That's not important. The teacher was white, and she said the very same thing. She said, she literally like made a broad announcement because kids kept asking her because it was a white teacher at a primarily Latino school, and none of these kids had filled out this form before. And so she got tired of people asking her. So she announced the whole class, if you are Latino, if you are Mexican, just put white. You have descendants from Spain. Technically, legally, you count as a white person.
Which is disgusting.
Yeah. And, I don't know whether or not she meant it. Like,
she did. She probably.
It was probably just something ingrained in her. Like, it made sense to her, and she was just trying to make it easier for us. But literally, word got out to the principal because someone was offended by it. Like students were offended by it. And at the time, I was young. I was not as well self-aware. So I wasn't necessarily offended, but I was confused. Like, that doesn't feel right. I can't go into a white community and just assume that I'm one of them because I'm not white.
But it's like,
yeah, the principal made her correct herself. He was like, and the next day she was like, I'm sorry, I didn't realize how offensive that would be. Definitely either leave it blank or like put, look into your heritage, because some kids were Native American. That was the thing. Now that I remember, there was a student at that school who was Native American, and it was like offensive to her. Yeah,
I mean that's the thing is like we technically, if we're mestizo, we're all Native in some way, and identifying things is very murky because obviously we definitely want to respect, especially if you're Mexican or Latin American. It's important to respect like the native peoples that still live there,
Right.
that it still exist, even though we're taught these weird things about how they all disappeared randomly and how like
Someone told me there's like something like 60 indigenous languages still spoken in Mexico.
Yeah, I think it's 68. I could be wrong, but it's between 60 and 70 of non-Spanish, indigenous languages being spoken. But yeah, that's the thing is like we are native. We have native ancestry. And it's so weird because I remember thinking this was weird too. And so again, like I'll just say real quick, like this book is great for like just there's so many things that Julissa talks about in her book that I think I resonated with, that I've heard constantly. So it's kind of just like very reaffirming a lot of these thoughts that we all have, that we kind of share. And like, in a way, we've been sharing them. We've been experiencing these thoughts quietly with like not knowing that this is how so many people feel, especially that, she's from a different part of the country.
Yeah.
But she talks about how we're all taught to be proud of being descendants of Aztecs, right?
Yeah, but at the same time,
we ignore like the Aztecs that are currently alive, or the
indigenous people.
the Mexica and the indigenous people that are there now, and we also like discriminate against indigenous peoples, like, so it's a weird thing of like how much like white supremacy rules kind of like, I want to be careful how I say this, but you can't ignore white supremacy. You can't ignore like the reach of white supremacy within the Latin community, because there's so many things in it, just like very, very like run of the mill, like what feels like run of the mill, like very like everyday happenings. Like,
I mean, it's even something come to my mind of I know someone who is Mexican. Their parents are Mexican. Their grandparents are Mexican, but they lived in a predominantly like white environment, and so they'll say stuff like, whenever a topic like this comes up, they'll jokingly say something like, "Well, I'm not Mexican," and what they're trying to say is, "I'm not that Mexican," and I think maybe when they were younger, it was like a joke that was made to imply that it's a bad thing to be that Mexican. And nowadays it's more of a thing of like, well, I can't connect 100% because I don't understand that point of view, which I understand that that's what they're saying. But at the same time, sometimes I want to be like, well, no, you are. You're Mexican just because you are. Yeah. And no one can take that from you. And while it might feel disingenuous, it's because that's how someone else taught you to feel. It's not because that's not true.
Yeah, I mean, we were literally taught American history as if it were our own.
Yeah.
We have to learn about the fucking Civil War and U.S. presidents. And that's in the book. She talks a lot about that. And that's why I love that she put in all of these dates of like all of these historical things that happened. A lot of them are very brutal. Like they're kind of tragic things to learn about, but it's still very important to realize that like Mexicans fought in all of the American wars.
Yeah.
Like from the beginning. And like, there's things that happen where like the United States like literally recruited, Mexican farm workers to come and save their economy. And then when they were done with them, they deported all of them and then did it again.
Not only that, but they were used as scapegoats. They were like, in a very similar way to like modern times, they were like, well, they're taking all our jobs, so let's get them out of here.
Exactly. So, I'm kind of bird walking all over this, but you know, I do like that because it's stuff, you know, we were taught to be American, whether we, you know, especially we didn't speak Spanish, you know, had we had that closeness to the language, you know, we might have felt differently. I don't know how different we would be, you know, but at the same time, like, it just kind of motivated me to learn more, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I remember having a feeling. I think I even told you this once I finished the book, but I was like, for a long time through the book, I felt like I'd heard all of this before, and it clicked in my head after I finished. Like, it's not that I've heard someone else say this before; it's that I've also had these thoughts before, and it was like, you know, this book gave me a similar feeling that I felt when you guys first explained Isimo to me. Mm-hmm. Like, the initial feeling going into this book was, this is something necessary. This is something that a lot of people will relate to, even if they don't know it yet. And it's definitely a book I recommend. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. The thing is too, is that the book is so short that I don't know how much more we could talk about it without like just saying everything that happens in the book. But like I said, it's super digestible. And there's so much information, so much story in it, and so many like little anecdotes that I think a lot of people can relate to and kind of feel a connection to in their own, you know, life experience. There's so much of this stuff. It's interesting because, you know, coming from the no sabo side of things, about how much like shame we felt for not learning Spanish and for only knowing English, and to hear her perspective on how the English language has like how it affects Mexicans.
Yeah.
On all sides, on all fronts, because, you know, we're sitting here fucking having an identity crisis because we're not connected to the culture that was beat out of our people, you know.
Yeah.
And we're here, you know, struggling to reconnect with it. And then on her side of things, when she's talking about how she was one of those people that felt the pressure to speak English very well. That's why it was called. The interesting thing about the title is that she says this like in the beginning. You could hear it in like the example clip of like one time she was told, "You sound like a white girl," and she kind of like was like, "Oh, thank you." So she took it as a compliment, you know, just like that guy that said, "You're really well assimilated." Like not they think, because it's two different types, but like this idea of just like having to fit in, having to assimilate, and having to like, it's just like, it's just surviving. It's knowing you know what the consequences of not being a white American is.
Yeah.
So you try to achieve success in being as close to a white American as you can be.
Yeah, like that definitely reminds me of something. A specific memory came to mind when I read this book, and it's because of that concept. I've mentioned before that because of the environment I grew up in, I didn't really have to face that I was Latino until I was much older, and I was around a lot less Latinos because we went to primarily Latino schools. In high school, I had primarily Latino teachers. We had Latino doctors, Latino dentists. The entire police force was Latino. The mayor was Latino.
Yep.
And so because
the bakers were Latino,
yeah,
the pizza delivery guy was Latino.
My dog's Latino. I don't know. I was trying to, but so it was just
the mailman was Asian.
Yeah, but he was pretty tight. He remembered our name like 20 years later. It was awesome. He's a nice guy. But so I never really had to face being othered until I was much older. Shit, I need to pause. Just remember. Oh, but even with that context, I still noticed a pattern. I still noticed a difference with people who like spoke less English than they did Spanish, or people who had a darker complexion. And it brought to mind a memory of this woman that worked at my daycare. And I can't remember her name right now, but I know my mom knows her name. Like, she'll kill me for not remembering, because she used to babysit us. And something I remember recognizing as a kid was she and several other women that worked at our daycare were not allowed to watch the older kids because they had communication issues, because Spanish was their first language. They didn't speak a lot of English. So they were in charge of like the toddlers and the babies because it was easier. And when they would try to fill in for someone who didn't show up or try to advance at their job, they'd often get in a lot more trouble than the other teachers, because they'd have difficulties dealing with the children because the children wouldn't listen to them because they couldn't explain themselves in English. And she specifically had an issue because she had a daughter that went to that daycare, but she was one of the older kids. And so she didn't have someone who could translate for her. She didn't have access to her daughter because they put her in a different place, and they always talked about her differently. And I even remember talking about this with someone recently, and when they remembered who I was talking about, what they said was, "You mean the one with like a lot of indigenous features, right?" And I remember they didn't mean anything by that, but I remember that was the distinction about this woman, was like she was she had like the darkest complexion of all the adults that worked here. And it reminded me of this like weird hierarchy, because it made me think of everyone that was in charge of that daycare was a lot lighter skinned. They were all Latina, but the people that were higher ranked all seemed to be of lighter skin. And I noticed that as a kid, but it didn't mean anything to me until I was an adult, especially like until after I read this book.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of that, how they talk about how Julissa shares a lot of anecdotes of her own and a few other like authors and storytellers of how English affects, the immigrant household, where like it kind of creates barriers, because she talks about she herself wanting to perfect her English accent. She lost a lot of Spanish in doing so, and lost kind of communication with some of her family through that, because she couldn't speak as well as she wanted. And it's a common thing with, children of immigrants, that when they start to learn Spanish, or when they start to learn English, they start enjoying, like, they shared about like something simple that I never thought about was like, something so simple that I never thought about was going to the movies or watching movies with the family. You do that as a family.
Right.
And like they weren't able to do that because their parents wouldn't watch movies with them because they couldn't understand what was going on. And so to me, that was like, I just never saw how... I knew how assimilating affected like our experience, but it was like, I don't know, I guess it's like we were talking about, where you don't blame the company that's hiring,
Right.
immigrants for less. Like, you don't blame the people at the top. And not that I blame my family or anything, but like, that's always seen of like, what is the reason for this? Of like, oh, your grandparents didn't teach you, your parents didn't teach you Spanish, and it kind of, with reading this, it kind of clicked with me, like how English is like the driving force, how assimilation and survival is the driving force for the reason why like I speak English and why I enjoy American media, which is crazy because it's like a weird barrier, because it's like people in Mexico enjoy American stuff and enjoy white stuff, but it's like I don't know. It's being in the United States is definitely a different experience. But that whole thing like surrounding like language, it's crazy because it does put up barriers, like we had parents on my mother's side, or we had great grandparents on my mother's side that, I was not able to talk to because they didn't speak English.
Right.
My Wito, that was one thing too, about my Wito that like I really enjoyed because he was very funny, even though we couldn't like talk to each other. Like I only spoke English, he only spoke Spanish, but he would still find ways to like make me feel welcome. And even though like my cousins or my tias would like tease me for not knowing Spanish, like he just like always made me feel welcome. He would always find like ways to show it, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
We would go over to their house and they would make food and all the kids would be, watching TV or whatever. And instead of like, coming out to be like, oh, the food's ready, come and eat, my Wito would come out and just like be like, have a real like angry look on his face and just like point and be like, and you have to imagine a really old man doing this because it was hilarious. Yeah, just like, and, it's just like silly stuff like that. So like, he passed away when I was like 13 or 14 and it sucked because it definitely did feel like he was kind of my connection to that part of like being Mexican.
Right.
Like having people that spoke Spanish around me and that also made me feel welcome. I like lost that even though I only saw him, like a couple times a year. And yeah, it was just like hard. And then when he passed and they were like giving away like stuff to like remember him and all this stuff, there was like letters that he had written back home and letters he had wrote to his wife or whatever. And you know what I found out?
What?
That this fool spoke English the whole time.
You thought you were his favorite?
That fool was the original prankster, man.
No, he was really funny.
I mean, he was here that long. Made sense. But yeah, so I don't know. It's just like this book, I thought it was really good. I can't say it enough. Like, I definitely recommend anybody picking it up. And it just, like we were talking about earlier, where it definitely creates like a sense of unity in people. Like that a lot of these things, I think currently, there's a huge push right now. Latinos are having a moment.
Yeah.
Like, and hopefully it's not just a moment, but there's patterns that we see, things of just like still weird stuff is still happening, but Latinos are in the spotlight right now, and there's a lot of stuff that we have going on that is succeeding, and I still think that we do still need I think that we might be hearing a lot of this, like these sentences being repeated. Like we hear a lot of these ideas about it being important to know your history and to know your culture and to like never forget like our true history. And I kind of feel like Julissa explains it really well in the book of like why it's so important. Because if we're not careful, like if we let other people tell our stories for us, then that puts us in the position that we were, years ago.
Yeah.
Where we won't be able to maintain where we're at right now.
Yeah. I definitely like for people who are interested in the book, I definitely like how she breaks it down. She breaks it into two parts. The first part focusing on the misconceptions or the lies of assimilation and the false promises made about assimilation. But the second half focuses more on representation, not only like representation for the community as a whole, but the importance of someone's individual journey and connection to their heritage. And like the importance of she there's this portion of it where she talks a lot about the evolving specific language around what we call ourselves in America, and how every few like generations a new word comes out or a new few words comes out. And she says that none of these are invalid and none of them 100% represent us, because they're all what that generation is feeling in that moment. They're all accurate for those individuals. And so they're all valid, and it's important for everyone to kind of be part of this in every aspect of being Latino.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it shows that one thing this book does really well, I think, is show that we're both very unique. Like, we're not a monolith. Our experiences are not the same, but we do have a lot of things that connect us as a people.
Yeah.
And that we should, support each other behind. I think this is a good place for, final thoughts. I know we kind of just gave them. There's not a lot, much more we can talk about. All I can say is that I highly recommend the book. We're not sponsored. We did not get any money for the publishers or anything, but I do highly recommend this book. I'll leave a link for it down below if you want to check it out. Ryan, what should they comment if they made it this far?
Actually, so there's no questions this week, but someone suggested on the Discord a potential book club, which we'll discuss further how to set that up. But if there's any books that you guys want to recommend for us by Latino authors or exploring Latino heritage, let us know in the comments.
Hell yeah. Don't forget to join our Discord and to follow us on all platforms. And I love you. Goodbye.
We're still working on the out phrase. Goodbye.
I think we should just go with
don't fly.
Should I tell that story just so we can fucking have that? Or I'll tell it on